Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about the devil in the Middle Ages. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Ever wake up in the dead of night, a nameless dread clinging to the edges of your mind? In the Middle Ages, that feeling had a name, a face, and a terrifyingly persuasive voice: the devil. Now we might reach for a glass of warm milk or scroll through soothing cat videos on our phones, but medieval people faced a world where the supernatural felt immediate and real. And this devil wasn't some abstract concept. He was a constant presence, lurking in the shadows, whispering temptations, and ready to snatch your soul with a contract signed in blood. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of that spam email promising you untold riches if you just click this one link. Only instead of riches, it's eternal damnation. The difference? Back then, people genuinely believed it. What would you do if everyone around you believed in a creature whose sole purpose was to corrupt and destroy? The pervasive fear of the devil shaped the medieval worldview in profound ways. Imagine living in a society where every misfortune, every illness, every crop failure could be attributed to his influence. Our modern anxieties about climate change or economic instability pale in comparison to the medieval dread of eternal torment. They didn't have therapy, they had exorcisms. And trust me, the copay was probably a lot higher. The religious and societal context of the time fueled this fear. The church, the ultimate authority, constantly preached about the devil's power and the consequences of sin. Sermons thundered with warnings about the temptations that awaited in every corner of life. Artwork depicted grotesque demons and horrifying scenes of hellfire. It was a constant barrage of reminders that the devil was always watching, always waiting. Speaking of artwork, this brings us to the devil's portrayal in medieval art. Forget the suave, sophisticated Lucifer of modern fiction. The medieval devil was usually depicted as a hideous beast, often with horns, claws, and a generally unpleasant demeanor. Think of him as the medieval version of a really bad Yelp review brought to life. These images weren't just for show. They were carefully crafted to instill fear and reinforce the Church's teachings. They served as a visual reminder of the consequences of sin and the dangers of succumbing to temptation. Even the gargoyles perched atop cathedrals weren't just decorative. They were believed to ward off evil spirits, acting as a sort of celestial bouncer service. Now that we've covered the fear and the visual representation, let's talk about the allure. The devil, as depicted in medieval lore, wasn't just a force of fear. He was also a tempter, offering forbidden power and earthly rewards in exchange for one's soul. It was like a reverse mortgage, only with your eternal destiny on the line. Imagine being a peasant struggling to survive, facing poverty, disease, and oppression. Then imagine the devil whispering in your ear, promising wealth, power, and escape from your misery. The temptation would be immense, wouldn't it? The allure of forbidden knowledge, the promise of control over one's destiny, All these were powerful motivators in a world where life was often brutal and unforgiving. Of course, the fine print on that demonic contract was probably longer than the entire Bible. But what good is temptation without opportunity? The belief in demonic pacts arose from this intersection of fear and allure. People believed that individuals, driven by desperation, ambition, or a thirst for knowledge, could enter into agreements with the devil, exchanging their souls for worldly benefits. These pacts were often described in elaborate detail, involving rituals, incantations, and the signing of contracts in blood. Think of it as the medieval version of a multi-level marketing scheme, only with a significantly worse cancellation policy. The Church, of course, condemned these pacts as the ultimate form of heresy, punishable by excommunication and, in some cases, death. The stories of those who allegedly made pacts with the devil served as cautionary tales, reinforcing the Church's authority and warning against the dangers of straying from the path of righteousness. From the whispers of temptation to the signing of a demonic contract, medieval life was filled with the delicate balance between the earthly and spiritual realms. What would you do if you truly believed the veil between worlds was thin and easily crossed? The sources that contributed to the popular perception of the devil's presence were varied and abundant. Sermons, as mentioned earlier, played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. But so did folklore, legends, and even personal testimonies. Stories of encounters with demons, of possessions, and of miraculous interventions were widespread, passed down through generations and embellished with each telling. These stories created a shared understanding of the devil's power and the dangers he posed. They were the medieval equivalent of urban legends, only with a significantly higher stakes. It was a world where the line between reality and superstition was blurred, where the supernatural was an everyday occurrence, and the devil was always lurking just around the corner, ready to strike a deal. Key takeaway? The medieval fear of the devil was a powerful force that shaped society, religion, and individual lives. Have you ever felt cornered, backed against a wall, with no escape in sight? Now, imagine that feeling amplified 1,000-fold, stretched out over years, woven into the very fabric of your existence. That was life for many in the Middle Ages, a life so riddled with hardship that the whispered promise of a shortcut, no matter how dark, might have sounded like salvation. What would you do if your children were starving, their bellies swollen with hunger, their eyes hollow with despair? If the crops failed again and the Lord demanded his due regardless? If sickness swept through your village, leaving a trail of empty homes and grieving hearts? These weren't hypothetical questions for medieval people. They were the brutal realities of daily life. Picture a peasant family in, say, 1348. The Black Death is ripping through Europe, and their village is not spared. They've already lost 2 children to the plague. The remaining ones are weak, constantly coughing. The fields lie untended because half the village is dead or dying. The lord of the manor, Sir Reginald the Unyielding, still expects his taxes, his tithes, his fealty. Where do they turn? The church offers solace, but their bellies remain empty. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the sheer grinding poverty that defines so many lives. We think of poverty today, and we might imagine struggling to pay bills, skipping meals, or living in substandard housing. But medieval poverty was a different beast altogether. It was a constant battle for survival, a desperate scramble for scraps. It meant living on the edge of starvation, vulnerable to every passing illness, every minor injury. But medieval people were pretty resilient. You know how you order food from Uber Eats when you don't feel like cooking? Well, medieval people didn't have Uber Eats. They had to make their food, and if the crops failed, they ate whatever they could find: roots, berries, bark, even dirt in extreme cases. If you've ever experienced a bad flu, imagine that multiplied by the threat of death hanging over every illness. Modern medicine can treat most ailments, but medieval medicine was more like educated guesswork mixed with superstition. A doctor might prescribe bloodletting for almost anything, which, let's be honest, probably made things worse. Imagine going to the doctor with a headache, and he's like, "I'm going to drain some blood, but first, let me check my astrology chart." But what good is sheer will when facing something like the Black Death? This plague wasn't just a nasty bug, it was a catastrophic event that wiped out a significant portion of Europe's population. It spread quickly, leaving a trail of unimaginable suffering in its wake. People died in agony, their bodies covered in grotesque buboes. The air was thick with the stench of death. It's hard to think that people found love during those times, maybe because they knew they were living on borrowed time. Key takeaway: medieval life was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and death, creating an environment where desperate measures might seem justifiable. Speaking of despair, let's consider the social upheavals of the time. The medieval social structure was rigidly hierarchical. You were born into a certain class, and you were generally expected to stay there. Peasants were bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lords. There was little opportunity for social mobility. Now, if you've ever felt stuck in a dead-end job, imagine that feeling amplified by the knowledge that you were destined to live and die in the same social strata. But what good is knowing your place if you don't like your place? The desire for something more, something better, is a fundamental human drive, and in the Middle Ages, that desire was often frustrated by the rigid social order. People yearned for wealth, for power, for freedom from oppression. If they didn't think they could do something, they knew their children would be stuck with the same problems. Think about modern-day lotteries and get-rich-quick schemes. People are drawn to them because they offer the tantalizing promise of instant wealth and social mobility. But medieval people didn't have lottery tickets. So if you wanted to climb the social ladder, you had to be incredibly lucky, incredibly talented, or incredibly ruthless. Or perhaps someone would say that you could make a pact with someone sinister. Now that we've covered social upheaval, let's talk about the justice system, or rather, the lack thereof. Medieval justice was often arbitrary and cruel. Punishments were harsh and often disproportionate to the crime. Torture was commonplace. And if you were poor and powerless, you were unlikely to receive a fair hearing. From harsh punishments to societal injustices, medieval life required both patience and a certain amount of cunning. Now imagine you're accused of a crime you didn't commit. You're dragged before the local lord, who acts as judge, jury, and executioner. He listens to the accusations, but he doesn't really care about the facts. He's more interested in pleasing his cronies and maintaining his power. You're found guilty, and you're sentenced to be hanged. Would you start singing "Another One Bites the Dust"? That is, if you knew what that song was. You know how we have lawyers to defend us in court? Well, medieval people often had to rely on their own wits and cunning to navigate the legal system. Sometimes they might seek the help of a cunning woman or a local wise man, but their resources were limited. Basically, you were on your own. Key takeaway: social and legal injustices fueled resentment and a desire for revenge, making the idea of striking a deal for retribution appealing to some. But what about those who sought not revenge, but simply relief from suffering? The Middle Ages were a time of great hardship, and people often turned to the supernatural for comfort and solutions. They believed in saints, miracles, and the power of prayer, but they also believed in demons, witches, and the devil. If you've ever prayed for something, you can understand the medieval desire for divine intervention. But what happens when your prayers go unanswered? What happens when you feel abandoned by God? This is where the devil might enter the picture, whispering promises of power, wealth, and escape from suffering. What would you do if you were terminally ill, suffering from agonizing pain with no hope of recovery? Modern medicine has given us painkillers and palliative care, but medieval people had limited options. They might try herbal remedies, prayers, or pilgrimages to holy sites, but sometimes nothing worked. Now consider the idea of making a deal with the devil to end your suffering. It's a desperate act, but desperation can drive people to do desperate things. From seeking relief from suffering to desiring supernatural solutions, medieval life required both faith and a certain amount of skepticism. You know how some people today turn to alternative medicine or conspiracy theories when conventional medicine fails them? Well, medieval people did something similar. They might consult with healers, fortune tellers, or even those rumored to consort with dark forces. It's a sign of the human need to find answers and solutions, even in the face of the unknown. Key takeaway: the desire for relief from suffering, coupled with a belief in the supernatural, created an environment where pacts with the devil might seem a viable option. But let's ground this in some examples, shall we? These stories, passed down through generations, offer a glimpse into the minds of those who might have contemplated such a pact. Picture the tale of Theophilus of Adana. This 6th century cleric, frustrated by his lack of advancement in the church, allegedly made a deal with the devil to secure a higher position. Now, if you've ever felt overlooked at work, imagine that feeling driving you to literally sell your soul. But what good is power if it comes at such a terrible price? The story goes that Theophilus eventually repented and sought the intercession of the Virgin Mary to break the pact. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the importance of remaining true to. They say the devil is in the details. But what were those details, back when folks genuinely believed you could sign on the dotted line, or, more accurately, in the puddle of blood, for a little earthly power? What hoops did you have to jump through to get Satan on speed dial? Let's delve into the supposed specifics of a demonic pact. If you've ever signed a cell phone contract, you've got a modern analog, convoluted terms, hidden fees, and a nagging suspicion you're being conned. But medieval people, they took this seriously. The difference was, instead of getting the latest iPhone, they were promised things like power, riches, or the ability to, say, make their neighbor's cow stop giving milk. Sure, it wasn't exactly a transparent deal, but when your alternative was, dying of dysentery, a little demonic assistance suddenly looked pretty tempting. Key takeaway: medieval people wanted the same things we do, just with more blood oaths involved. Now, speaking of blood oaths, let's talk about the ritual itself. Picture this: a grimy, candlelit room. Probably smells of unwashed wool and something vaguely rotten. Our protagonist, let's call him Bartholomew, is nervously clutching a quill, trying not to drip blood on his already questionable robes. The confessions, often extracted under, let's say, less than ideal circumstances, often painted a similar picture. Signing your name in blood was a common element, sort of like the medieval equivalent of clicking "I agree" on a terms of service agreement you haven't read, only slightly more dramatic. Bartholomew might have thought, "Oh goody, I hope this doesn't affect my credit score, and I hope I can cancel it next month." Then there was the renunciation of God, a big no-no, obviously. Like publicly dumping your significant other on Facebook. You're not just ending the relationship, you're making a statement. A statement that says, "Hey everyone, I'm now Team Satan." But what good is renouncing God without some proper incantations? Think of it like coding. You need the right sequence of words, the right syntax, or your program, or in this case, your demon, simply won't run. Bartholomew probably had to Google translate ancient Aramaic and wish it would be the right context for his demonic summoning. These incantations were often elaborate, filled with bizarre names and phrases that would make your Latin teacher shudder. They were designed to call upon specific demons, each with their own area of expertise. Need help with your love life? There's a demon for that. Crop failure? There's a demon for that, too. Medieval people found a way to outsource everything. Key takeaway: rituals were the medieval equivalent of filling out a very, very disturbing online form. So, from incantations to demonic seals. What are these, you may ask? Think of them as demonic QR codes, a visual representation of the demon's power, used to focus the ritual and ensure you're summoning the right entity. You wouldn't want to accidentally summon a demon of mild inconvenience when you were hoping for the demon of wealth and prosperity, would you? That would be like ordering a pizza and getting a salad. Utterly disappointing. The perceived power of these seals was immense. People believed they could bind demons, control them, and even force them to grant wishes. It was like having a universal remote for the underworld. Of course, the remote came with a lifetime subscription fee paid in souls. From demonic seals to promising eternal servitude. Now that we've opened the door to the demonic realm, who do we call? This was the real catch, the fine print hidden in the soul contract. In exchange for earthly favors, you promised your eternal soul to the devil. Basically, a timeshare in hell. This is where Bartholomew probably thought, "Crap, I can't get a refund after all, and there's a long line for customer service in hell." The concept of eternal servitude was terrifying to medieval people. Hell wasn't just a place of fire and brimstone. It was a place of endless torment, where you'd be subjected to all sorts of unspeakable horrors. And all because you wanted to win that local pie baking contest. But let's be real. How much of this was actually true? Probably not much. Most of these confessions were obtained under duress, through torture and manipulation. People were desperate to say anything to make the pain stop. Kind of like how you'd agree to anything to get a telemarketer off the phone. Now that we've explored the supposed specifics of a demonic pact, let's consider the role of magical practitioners. Think of them as the IT support of the demonic world. They were the ones who claimed to have the knowledge and skills to negotiate with demons, perform the rituals, and interpret the signs. But medieval people didn't have online forums and Stack Overflow. Instead, they had individuals who claimed to have an edge in the supernatural world. These magical practitioners ranged from cunning folk with herbal remedies and local charms to educated scholars dabbling in alchemy and demonology. They were the go-to people when you needed a spell cast, a curse removed, or just some general advice on how to avoid the wrath of the supernatural. They were the all-purpose mystical mechanics for daily life back then. The difference between these practitioners and your local pharmacist, well, one dispensed pills, the other potions brewed under the light of the moonlight full. And one probably charged a lot less for their services. Sure, it wasn't a perfect system, but when your alternative was relying solely on prayer and hoping for the best, a magical practitioner suddenly looked like a pretty good investment. But what good are magical practitioners without a solid understanding of demonology? This was the academic side of dealing with the devil. Books were written, treatises were debated, and entire systems of knowledge were built around understanding the hierarchy, powers, and weaknesses of demons. The Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, was like the owner's manual for the witch hunt. It described not only how to identify witches, but also how to interrogate and punish them. It was basically the medieval equivalent of a self-help book for witch hunters. The texts explored the different types of demons, their specialties, and how to summon them. Some demons were associated with specific sins, others with natural disasters, and still others with everyday annoyances like that leaky roof or the neighbor's gossiping wife. It was like a demonic yellow pages. Key takeaway: demonology was the medieval equivalent of a very dark and disturbing academic field. So, with magical practitioners armed with demonic seals, incantations, and knowledge, they would become intermediaries between ordinary people and the underworld. These magical practitioners often acted as mediators in pacts with the devil. They were the ones who allegedly drew up the contracts, performed the rituals, and ensured that both sides fulfilled their end of the bargain. Of course, this was a dangerous game. If you messed up a ritual or angered a demon, you could face dire consequences. Think of it like being a lawyer who accidentally misrepresents their client, only instead of getting disbarred, you get dragged to hell. Key takeaway: magical practitioners were the middlemen in a very risky business deal. Now that we've explored the rituals and the role of magical practitioners, let's look at the reckoning. What happened when the earthly favors ran out, and it was time to pay the piper, or in this case, the devil? The end of a demonic pact was rarely a happy affair. According to the stories, the devil always came to collect his due, often in a spectacularly gruesome fashion. Think of it like repossession, only instead of taking your car, he's taking your soul. But what good is earthly power when you know your soul is destined for eternal damnation? That's the ultimate question. Did these people actually believe they were making a deal with the devil? Or were they just desperate, misguided souls looking for a way to cope with the harsh realities of medieval life? Ultimately, the idea of making a pact with the devil reflects the anxieties and uncertainties of the time. It was a way for people to explain the inexplicable, to make sense of the misfortunes and hardships they faced. The medieval world was full of people struggling, so it became natural to make pacts with the devil in order to rise above others. Sure, it wasn't a rational explanation, but when your life is filled with plagues, famines, and wars, a little irrationality is understandable. It's like believing in a lucky charm when your favorite sports team is losing. It might not actually work, but it makes you feel better. Now that we've explored the anatomy of a devil's pact, we ask, what does it all mean? The anatomy of a devil's pact reflects a lot about the fears, beliefs, and desires of medieval people. It shows us how they grappled with the forces of good and evil, how they... The night is quiet, isn't it? Just you, me, and the echoes of centuries past. Tonight, let's delve into a particularly unsettling chapter of history, the witch hunts of the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Specifically, the skewed lens through which women were viewed. If you've ever felt unfairly judged, imagine the weight of accusations fueled by fear, superstition, and deeply ingrained misogyny. What would you do if someone whispered that you were in league with the devil? Not a casual insult, but a genuine belief, one that could lead to torture, imprisonment, or even death. This was the reality for countless women during the witch hunts. It wasn't just about casting spells. It was about perceived deviance from societal norms, amplified by religious anxieties. Long before social media pile-ons, whispers and rumors could condemn a person to unspeakable horrors. Now, the core question: why were women disproportionately targeted? It wasn't as if men were immune to accusations, but the statistics paint a stark picture. Several factors contributed to this imbalance. First, consider the prevailing view of women at the time. Think back to that medieval misogyny. Were women seen as inherently weaker, more susceptible to temptation? Absolutely. Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden loomed large, forever casting a shadow of suspicion. It's like blaming the intern for the company's bad quarterly earnings, except the intern is an entire gender. Secondly, the patriarchy wasn't a buzzword. It was the bedrock of society. Men held the power, and any challenge to that power, real or imagined, was met with fierce resistance. Women who were independent, outspoken, or economically self-sufficient often found themselves in the crosshairs. Ever wonder what happens when you give women power? Some medieval men were about to find out. Let's dive a bit deeper. If you were running a patriarchal society, who would you target? Probably independent people. Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's talk about the infamous witch's mark. This wasn't a trendy tattoo. It was believed to be a physical sign of a pact with the devil. The idea was that during the unholy ritual, the devil would mark his new recruit, leaving an indelible stamp on their body. But what exactly did this mark look like? Basically anything out of the ordinary. A birthmark, a mole, a scar, even a patch of skin that was less sensitive to pain. Imagine the absurdity. Having a freckle could be a death sentence. Doctors today would laugh, but in the Middle Ages, witch hunters took these signs very seriously. They would meticulously examine the accused, probing and poking, searching for any imperfection that could be construed as evidence of demonic influence. It was like a medieval version of Where's Waldo? But instead of finding a quirky guy in a striped shirt, you were finding potential fuel for the pyre. Think of it like this. If you've ever looked for something that isn't there, you're sure to find it. Here's the thing. The discovery of a witch's mark was often a self-fulfilling prophecy. The examiner, already convinced of the accused's guilt, would interpret any anomaly as proof. Torture also played a role, of course. Under duress, people will say anything to make the pain stop. "Yes, devil, I pledge my allegiance," they might cry, just to get a moment's reprieve. Sure, the confessions were probably worthless, but who cares? You get a witch, and the patriarchy is happy. But what good is a witch's mark without the devil's touch? Ah, the devil's touch. This concept was closely related to the witch's mark and involved poking the accused with needles. The devil's touch was also a method employed to identify witches. Witch hunters would prick the accused with needles, searching for spots on the body that were insensitive to pain. These spots, they claimed, were where the devil had touched the witch, bestowing upon them their dark powers. The process was cruel and, unsurprisingly, highly unreliable. Inquisitors often used retractable blades or dulled needles to create the illusion of insensitivity. It was a performance, a charade, designed to confirm pre-existing biases and justify the persecution of innocent individuals. This is one case where the stage magic went a bit too far, though. Now that we've explored the dark world of witches' marks and devil's touches, let's talk about the broader context of these accusations. It's important to remember that the witch hunts weren't just about superstitious beliefs, they were also about power dynamics. Speaking of power dynamics, here's where gender comes into play. Women who challenged the established order were particularly vulnerable. Midwives, healers, and herbalists, for example, possessed knowledge that was often viewed with suspicion. Their expertise in matters of life and death threatened the authority of the church and the medical establishment, both of which were dominated by men. Being a medical professional in the Middle Ages was probably like being a successful entrepreneur on Shark Tank, but medieval doctors had far fewer regulations to worry about. But what good is the patriarchy if not for the power to oppress? Older women, especially those who were widowed or lived alone, were also at greater risk. They lacked the protection of a male guardian and were often seen as easy targets. Loneliness and isolation made them vulnerable to accusations and rumors. It was a cruel twist of fate. The very circumstances that made them pitiable also made them suspect. This is why you should always trust your elders. They will always look out for you. From accusations to persecutions, medieval life could be quite chaotic. In the 21st century, we have forensic science, DNA evidence, and legal processes to ensure a fair trial. But medieval people had none of these tools. They relied on superstition, hearsay, and the pronouncements of self-proclaimed experts. The difference was stark. We strive for objectivity, while they embraced subjectivity. Sure, our system isn't perfect, but it's a far cry from the witch trials. When your alternative is torture and execution based on rumors, due process suddenly looks incredibly appealing. But now that we understand how witch trials could be made up, let's talk about the very real-world implications of them. Now that we've covered the accusations, let's talk about the social consequences of being labeled a witch. The impact on a woman accused of witchcraft was devastating. Even if she managed to escape execution, her reputation was ruined, her family ostracized, and her life forever altered. The stigma of witchcraft was a heavy burden to bear, one that could haunt generations. The consequences were real. It was like being cancelled on social media, except the stakes were much, much higher. Here's the thing. Fear of witches wasn't just a societal quirk. It was a powerful tool for social control. By demonizing certain groups of people, those in power could reinforce existing hierarchies and suppress dissent. It's a classic tactic, one that has been used throughout history. Just look at McCarthyism in the 1950s, or, well, basically any political campaign ever. When your primary goal is maintaining power, everyone else just becomes a chess piece. At least the witch trials had more exciting stakes, though. From power to control, medieval life was all about the game. Speaking of control, let's reflect on how the witch hunts mirrored broader anxieties about female agency. In a society that sought to confine women to the domestic sphere, any display of independence or intellectual curiosity was seen as a threat. The night whispers, doesn't it? When the world sleeps, anxieties stir, and the past seems a little closer. Tonight, let's delve into the disquieting world of confessions, specifically those extracted during the height of the witch trials in the Middle Ages. What would you do if your freedom, your very life, depended on uttering words you didn't believe? Imagine you're accused of witchcraft. You're hauled before stern-faced inquisitors, people who genuinely believe they're saving your soul by breaking your body first. Long before polygraph tests and DNA evidence, the only proof they needed was your own admission, often obtained through methods that would make a modern torturer blush. It's not exactly a fun situation to be in, is it? Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the confessions themselves. These weren't spontaneous outpourings of guilt, mind you. They were carefully crafted narratives, pieced together from rumors, local folklore, and, most importantly, what the inquisitors already believed to be true. But medieval people were not stupid. They knew how to extract information to prove their point. The difference was the medieval people had torture on their side. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. Speaking of torture, this brings us to the lovely assortment of techniques employed to loosen tongues. Sleep deprivation was a favorite. Imagine being kept awake for days, your mind frayed, your senses heightened, and every creak of the dungeon echoing like a thunderclap. It's like pulling an all-nighter before a major exam, but instead of caffeine, you're fueled by fear and the persistent threat of, well, worse. And then there were the physical methods, the rack, the thumb screws, the strappado. These weren't just about inflicting pain, they were about breaking the will. Here's the thing: anyone can be made to say anything under enough duress. Even Captain America would crack eventually. But what good is physical torment without a little psychological manipulation? Enter the leading question. Did you fly on a broomstick to the Sabbath? Did you renounce God and pledge allegiance to the devil? These questions weren't designed to elicit truth. They were designed to confirm preconceived notions. The medieval equivalent of gaslighting, but with instruments of torture. The difference was the medieval people had a good reason to gaslight people. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. From physical and psychological torment to leading questions, we arrive at the heart of the matter, the content of the confessions themselves. What did these accused witches actually say? You know how, in movies, the devil is always this charismatic, charming figure. Not so much in the witch trials. The devil of these confessions was often a cold, indifferent, and sometimes even impotent figure. He might demand allegiance, but he offered little in return. These confessions often described elaborate Sabbaths, gatherings where witches supposedly feasted, danced, and engaged in unspeakable acts. They often involved grotesque parodies of Christian rituals, like mock baptisms and inverted prayers. They were, in essence, the dark mirror of medieval religious life. Basically, the medieval people wanted to deface the church. The difference was the medieval people had torture on their side. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. But here's where things get interesting. The confessions were often wildly inconsistent, not only from person to person, but even within the same individual's testimony. One moment, a woman might claim to have flown to the Sabbath. The next, she might contradict herself, saying she was there in spirit only. It's as if the truth was a slippery eel, constantly wriggling out of reach. Ever wonder why people would lie? The difference was the medieval people were trying to save their own skin. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. But here's where things get interesting. The confessions were often wildly inconsistent, not only from person to person, but even within the same individual's testimony. One moment, a woman might claim to have flown to the Sabbath. The next, she might contradict herself, saying she was there in spirit only. It's as if the truth was a slippery eel, constantly wriggling out of reach. Ever wonder why people would lie? The difference was the medieval people were trying to save their own skin. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. But here's where things get interesting. The confessions were often wildly inconsistent, not only from person to person, but even within the same individual's testimony. One moment, a woman might claim to have flown to the Sabbath. The next, she might contradict herself, saying she was there in spirit only. It's as if the truth was a slippery eel, constantly wriggling out of reach. Ever wonder why people would lie? The difference was the medieval people were trying to save their own skin. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. But here's where things get interesting. The confessions were often wildly inconsistent, not only from person to person, but even within the same individual's testimony. One moment, a woman might claim to have flown to the Sabbath. The next, she might contradict herself, saying she was there in spirit only. It's as if the truth was a slippery eel, constantly wriggling out of reach. Ever wonder why people would lie? The difference was the medieval people were trying to save their own skin. Sure, it wasn't ideal, and people would sometimes die from the extraction method. When your alternative was heresy, suddenly a false confession looked brilliant. Key takeaway: confessions were less about truth and more about fitting a predetermined narrative. But here's where things get interesting. The confessions were often wildly inconsistent, not only. The legacy of fear, from medieval belief to modern imagination. Ever lay awake, haunted by a stray thought, a lingering fear? Perhaps it's the fear of failure, the fear of losing control, or maybe even the fear of the unknown. Long before therapists and self-help books, medieval minds grappled with similar anxieties, often personifying them in the form of the devil and his insidious pacts. Tonight, we delve into how those medieval fears continue to echo in our modern stories and imagination. The Faustian bargain, a timeless temptation. What if you could have anything you desired: power, knowledge, youth, but at a terrible price? This is the essence of the Faustian bargain, a trope born from the medieval fascination with demonic pacts. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of hitting agree on a terms and conditions document without actually reading it. Only the consequences are considerably more eternal. But medieval people took this very seriously. Stories of individuals trading their souls for earthly benefits, usually told as cautionary tales, were rampant. From scholars hungry for forbidden knowledge to desperate peasants seeking relief from poverty, the allure of a deal with the devil was a constant theme. And let's be honest, who hasn't dreamed of a little demonic intervention when facing a particularly daunting tax return? The difference, of course, is our perspective. Today, we might see these stories as metaphors for ambition and the dangers of unchecked desire. Medieval audiences, however, believed them literally. Sure, it wasn't always nuanced storytelling, but when your world is filled with unexplained misfortunes and the constant threat of eternal damnation, a tempting shortcut offered by a charismatic demon suddenly looks appealing. When your alternative was a lifetime of backbreaking labor and a fiery eternity, a Faustian deal might seem like a calculated risk. Key takeaway: the Faustian bargain reflects the enduring human struggle with temptation and the pursuit of forbidden desires. From manuscript to mass media, the devil's enduring appeal. Speaking of Faust, his story has been retold countless times, inspiring literature, opera, and even, dare I say, the plot of numerous superhero origin stories. Medieval manuscripts might seem a far cry from Hollywood blockbusters, but the core theme remains the same: the seductive allure of power and the inevitable price of ambition. Think about it. Every time a character makes a questionable deal to gain some advantage, there's a little bit of Faust in them. But what good is a story if it doesn't keep getting adapted, right? Medieval morality plays were often performed in town squares, providing dramatic depictions of demonic pacts. These performances served as public warnings against straying from the path of righteousness. It's like a medieval version of a public service announcement, only with more fire and brimstone. Modern retellings, whether in novels, films, or television shows, allow us to explore the complexities of human nature and the consequences of our choices in a safe, fictional space. The difference: medieval audiences viewed these stories as real possibilities, while we often interpret them as allegories. Sure, it wasn't always subtle, but when your worldview is steeped in religious dogma, these narratives carried considerable weight. When your alternative was a sermon, a theatrical depiction of a soul being dragged to hell by demons was definitely a more engaging way to spend an afternoon. Key takeaway: the devil's story has been adapted to keep pace with society's ever-changing storytelling mediums, demonstrating the tale's enduring relevance. The Devil in Art: Visualizing the Unseen. Now that we've discussed the literary legacy of demonic pacts, let's talk about how these beliefs were visualized. Medieval art was not just decorative, it was didactic. It sought to teach, to warn, and to inspire. Depictions of the devil and his demonic entourage were common, serving as stark reminders of the ever-present threat of evil. Think of it as a medieval version of a "Don't Do Drugs" campaign, only with more grotesque imagery. But medieval artists didn't just depict generic demons. They created intricate, often terrifying visual representations of the forces of darkness. From Bosch's nightmarish landscapes to the detailed depictions of hell in illuminated manuscripts, these works offered a glimpse into the medieval imagination and the depths of their fears. And let's be real, some of these images are so disturbing they could give even the most seasoned horror fan nightmares. The difference lies in the intention. While modern horror often seeks to entertain and thrill, medieval art aimed to instill a sense of piety and fear of divine judgment. Sure, It wasn't always pleasant, but when your world lacked photography or moving pictures, these visual representations had a profound impact. When your alternative was a bland religious icon, a vividly rendered demon was far more likely to grab your attention. Key takeaway: medieval art served to visualize the abstract concepts of good and evil, making them more tangible and impactful for the faithful. Folklore and fairy tales, the devil in disguise. But what good is art if it doesn't trickle down into popular culture? The belief in demonic pacts also found its way into folklore and fairy tales, often disguised in allegorical form. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of urban legends, passed down through generations, each telling a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed, ambition, and straying from the path of righteousness. It's like a medieval game of telephone, where the message gets slightly distorted with each retelling. But medieval folklore wasn't just about scaring people into obedience. It also offered a way to process anxieties and fears through storytelling. Characters who made deals with supernatural forces often faced dire consequences, serving as a warning to others who might be tempted to do the same. And let's be honest, sometimes these stories are so absurd they're downright hilarious. The difference: many modern fairy tales have happy endings, while medieval folklore often ended with a soul being dragged to hell. Sure, it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, but when your world was filled with hardship and uncertainty, these stories offered a sense of control and a reminder of the importance of moral behavior. When your alternative was a life of poverty and despair, a cautionary tale about the devil was a small price to pay for a sense of security. Key takeaway: folklore and fairy tales provide a window into the fears and beliefs of medieval society, highlighting the importance of morality and the consequences of straying from the righteous path. The enduring power of belief, fear, and the human psyche. Now that we've explored the artistic and folkloric manifestations of the fear of demonic pacts, let's talk about the power of belief itself. The medieval worldview was deeply rooted in faith, and the belief